Welcome back. I have a premium project today, and it is going to require some of my premium wood. I have these 3 pieces of cedar and 3 pieces of my premium pine pallet wood. I have some of that leftover cedar and some more of that leftover cedar. And we are going to turn this into another toolbox top. But this one's going to be a little different. We're not going to bolt this one down. It's got me a little bit nervous. So, let's start the milling process. To the miter saw, because we got to break this down. I'm not going to run it like this. I can't have this shit bouncing around. So we're going to cut it into smaller lengths, and we don't have to take so much of it off at the joiner. Boing. So if you've seen the last video, you've seen where I made my Makita charging station. That is actually the last of my cedar that I had unintentionally bought intentionally. So this is not technically the last of it. That was the last of it. This is the project I was referring to in the last video that I was working on, but I couldn't show y'all because it wasn't done yet. Now I finished this a couple of days ago and got it installed in the toolbox, and it looks absolutely phenomenal. If I had not burned this guy's name into this top, I would have made a cabinet out of it myself to put in my kitchen. So I am using the combination of this cedar and this pine because he asked for a two-tone look, and I do not have enough other wood other than these pine pallet boards to make a 17 7/8 width by 40 3/4 inch top. Now we are shooting for a 1-inch thickness on this, and that is one of the things that's got me fairly nervous, because the last couple of toolbox tops I did without being bolted down started to look like a Pringle after a couple of days. And if you're not sure what a Pringle is, well, it's a potato chip. I'm pretty sure everybody knows what Pringles are. But anyway, it started to, cup. Yeah, it started to cup on the toolbox because there was no airflow underneath of these toolbox tops. Therefore, the top was drying, but the bottom was not. And it was really starting to cause a problem. So we figured that if we bolted them down, it would hold them tight to the toolbox and keep them flat. And that worked pretty well. So to make this top, we are starting out with the slats at 1.25 inches thick. The reason we are at 1.25 inches thick is because we still have to hit the joiner and the planer. And to come in at a 1-inch thickness, I need to be able to make sure everything is dead flat all the time while gluing everything up. And I'm going to be able to run these through the planer at least twice. The first glue up will be done in less than 6-inch sections. That way I can hit the joiner after the first glue up, and then we will go through the planer. Once we get through the planer and the second glue up, then I will be able to scrape and clean up the glue on the bottom and send it through the planer once again. That second trip through the planer will be to bring it to its final thickness, and that'll bring us to our final glue up, and after that glue up, it'll just be a lot of sanding. That way we can get all the glue squeeze out cleaned up and make sure everything is still dead flat at 1 inch in thickness. Why 1-inch thickness is the first question. Well, that's because that is the absolute thickest I could get him to sign off on. See, he actually only wanted it to be about a 1/2 inch thick so that it just was a little taller than what the lip on the top of his toolbox was. I really did not feel comfortable making one that thin. I was just guaranteeing that it was for sure going to turn into a potato chip at that thickness. So I got him to sign off on a 1-inch thickness. Now, why not bolt it down? Well, most people who spend those big dollars on their toolboxes don't want to drill holes in their toolboxes. I completely understand that. Another reason that he doesn't want to bolt it down is because he wants to store paperwork underneath of this top. He does so now underneath a rubber mat that came with the toolbox and wants to be able to continue that practice because he's done it for years and that is what he is used to. Besides the fact that nobody wants to dedicate a very valuable tool drawer to paperwork. I understand that as well. So we are going to make this thing sit up just slightly off of his toolbox with some cutting board feet. That way we are getting some airflow to the bottom of it, and maybe it will dry at the same rate and stay flat. Now, some of the first mistakes that I had made on the other 3 toolbox tops was my wood was not completely dry. See, it was pallet wood that I had picked up from a lawnmower place that just stored them outside. So they were pretty damp and I did not give them suitable time for drying. Therefore, they were still very wet and they actually shrank quite a bit, and when they shrank, they warped, so that was a huge problem. Now, the wood I am using here in this video has been inside my shop for well over a year. The cedar about 1.5 years, and some of these pine pallet boards have been in here for almost 2 years, which is one of the reasons why I had mentioned them being premium pallet boards, because these pallet boards are 93 inches long, a little better than 3/4 inch thickness, and right around 4 inches wide. So these are great pallet boards, and I do not have access to these kind of pallet boards anymore. By this point, you can start to see the pattern forming. Each one of those boards has been milled to 1.25 inches by 3/4. The reason I went with 3/4 is because the 17 7/8 was going to require around 24 of these 3/4 inch slats. So it gave me kind of an even number to work with. And I put 4 of the cedar slats on the outside, 3 of the pine slats, and then 2 of the cedar slats. Why 3 and then 2? Well, just keep watching. You'll find out. I kind of wanted to make a square profile, and you'll see why here shortly. But anyways, after getting all the glue squeezed out, we can run this second set through the planer. And the reason is because, well, we're about 12 inches wide now, and I only have a 13-inch planer. So this is working fantastic so far. And it's time for the final glue up. Now I'm going to have to make sure that I keep these dead flat and make sure all the edges are lined up just perfect, because if I don't, sanding is going to be an absolute nightmare. So while I'm doing this last glue up, I want to set up a couple of my next videos. See, this is my assembly table. It is also my outfeed table. It is also where I glue everything up. So usually I will do my glue ups at the end of the day before I go into the house. That way they could dry overnight. Because, well, while they're sitting on my table, I can't run my table saw. I can't necessarily assemble any other projects. So at the end of the day is when I have to do them. Now, this particular project, I actually had some errands run. So between the second glue up and the last glue up, I was able to run errands, therefore letting it dry for 2 to 3 hours, and I was able to knock out 2 glue ups in one day. That last glue up gave me time to run out and get this cedar board for my slab guy. Now, the reason I had to go get another cedar board is because I did not have thick enough wood to make a 1-inch breadboard on the very ends. So I had to go get a thicker piece, and this guy always has exactly what I need. This is the first time I've ever done breadboards. So I set up some stops at the end of my router table, and I'm using a 1/2 inch bit to cut the breadboard grooves in it. I'm taking the bit up just a little bit at a time, about 1/4 inch at a time, until I come to my final depth, which I think was about 1 3/8 or 1.5 inches, somewhere around there. But this worked fantastic. I was really worried about doing these breadboards because I don't have a mortising machine, and I don't know, it was just really intimidating. But after doing them like this, it was super simple, super satisfying. I just wish I had put a bigger plate in my router. That way those chips would have cleared a little bit easier. Because that dust collection hose on top, that thing ain't doing nothing. So just a little FYI, when you're doing something like this, put a bigger opening in your plate. That way your chips fall down and you don't have to clean them out every single time. One of the errands I had to run was to go pick up some dowel rods for this project. For the breadboards, obviously. So I went to Lowe's and I found a bag of 12-inch poplar dowel rods, and I think the poplar will match the pine very well. And I was right. You'll see. But anyway, I went ahead and drilled these holes with a slightly smaller than 3/8 drill bit. That way it would be very snug. I mean, I'm talking like a couple of thousandths. We're not like, you know, a full fraction shorter than what the dowel rods are. You don't want that much short. Now that I have the breadboards drilled and planed and all happy, ready to go, we can go ahead and square up the top. Now, I'm only going to square up one end of the top because I had mentioned earlier this is my first time doing breadboards. I put in my dado stack, and we are going to do one side first, and then we will get a measurement to see how much of this top I need to cut off to do the other side. I would love to be able to tell y'all that I nailed this on my first try. That is actually not what I'm going to tell you. What I'm going to tell you is that I actually ran it just a little shy of where I thought it was going to need to be. And then I used my breadboard to check the measurements. I wanted to make sure that they were going to land as flush as possible. And it actually worked out very well for me. Just to let you know, they do end up fitting very snug, but loose enough that I can tap them around with my hand. You can see me here checking and making sure that everything is going to work out. This, as intimidating as I thought it was going to be, was actually very easy. Just take your time in your setup and everything will come up roses. The next thing I got to do is I got to cut the tenon shorter. A pull saw works pretty good for that. Now, I don't have any chisels to clean up the waste that is left over because I didn't want to get my pull saw too close to my nice crisp dadoed line, and well, it left a little bit. But I do have a brand new pack of razor blades I've been dying to cut my fingers on. Yeah, I'm just kidding. I didn't really cut my fingers, but I sure did feel like I was going to. But I did use razor blades to clean up the edges. It worked very good. I do really need to go buy a set of sharp chisels. Now this next part I had seen in videos where people mark it, they drill the hole just a little bit inside, and honestly I tried it on the first side and I do not have the correct drill bits for that. See, the drill bits I have were bought for metalworking and not woodworking. I need a set of brad point bits for this kind of operation. Do not have those. So this is me clamping the breadboards snugly in place and drilling holes, and this ended up working a lot better for me because I don't have the correct drill bits for this operation. After that, we can waller out the 2 end holes that will allow for expansion and contraction of the wood inside the breadboard. You don't do this on the center hole, just the outside holes. The center hole you leave nice and snug at 3/8. That holds the breadboard tight, and you do not want to waller it out forward and backward, just side to side. Then you glue the center, and only the center. Just about maybe 2 to 3 inches of the center you put glue on. You put the breadboard on, and you're going to go ahead and glue the center pin in place. The 2 outside pins only get glue to hold the pins in place. What you do is you put glue in the bottom side of the breadboard, tap the pin in most of the way, and then put a little bit of glue on your pin. That way you're only gluing the pins to the breadboard and not the tenon itself. You want that tenon to be able to shrink and expand inside the breadboard. You can see me using the clamp to make sure that my holes are coming in alignment when I'm putting the pins in. Because on the first one I did, trying to draw bore, I ended up blowing my breadboard out and I had to make a completely new breadboard. Now, I don't really need to tell you this in this video, but I just want to let you know that mistakes happen and sometimes, well, you have to go get another piece of wood. So while the glue was still wet, I went ahead and I cut my pins off. Why do I do it when it's still wet? Well, I'll be able to hit it with a sander and all that sawdust will combine with the wet wood, filling in any of the gaps that may have showed up if I had not. And it gives it a super smooth, super clean look that looks fantastic when it's finished. All the gaps look fantastic when this thing gets done. You'll have to stick around to see the finished product. So the entire process for designing this board is flat. Everything has to stay flat. It is going to live in a very, very dry atmosphere. I work in an injection molding facility and everything is very, very dry. So this wood is going to shrink for sure. There's no doubt in my mind it's going to shrink. But I don't want it to warp. So I have to design everything about this board to keep it very flat. This is another design element that I am adding to try to keep it as flat as possible. And it does add a very unique look to this. This is that square design that I was talking about earlier. See, I'm going to inlay a 1/4 inch piece of cedar through not necessarily the center. We are about 2 1/4 inches from the cedar breadboard. Why 2 1/4 inches? Well, because those 3 pine boards that are in there are 2 1/4 inches. So that gives it 4 squares on all 4 corners that are pine, and one in the center that is kind of rectangular, bringing a much, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, hell, we'll just go with fancy. Fancy's a pretty word because this is a pretty fancy board. After explaining my design ideas to the client, he asked a question. He says, "Isn't that a little too much for a toolbox?" We looked at my toolbox and I said, never in the time I've had this toolbox has anybody looked at that toolbox and said, that's too much for a toolbox. No, what everybody says about my toolbox is says, dude, that is awesome. So why would you make a top that is just enough to get the job done and not enough to grab attention? That's how you do a toolbox. Now, we can go ahead and put the profile on here. Now, I offered him 3 different profiles, and he, of course, chose my favorite one. I offered him the round over, which is on my toolbox. I offered him the bead and groove, which I personally really like. And I offered him the chamfer. So he obviously picked the chamfer. So I'm going to put a 45-degree chamfer all the way around what is going to be the actual top of this. So I have my chamfer bit chucked up here. Let's give her hell. So this chamfered edge is probably the most subtle thing on this entire top. Everything else is so much that just this one little tiny touch of a chamfered edge, I feel like the bead and groove would have been that little bit extra to make it pop. I mean, just completely blow everything away. But the chamfer did look absolutely fantastic on this. And I am glad he went with it, because everything I put a chamfer on, man, it is just enough to do absolutely everything that you would want in a profile. And of course, we had to go through all of the grids. We went through 80, 120, 180, 220, just to get everything nice and smooth. Once we got it nice and smooth, this is where I was burning his name in. Now, the reason I am burning it in now is because, well, I had to wait on a couple of holes to fill. I tried to use some epoxy to fill those holes, and, well, the epoxy itself is like 5 years old, and it's cold in my shop. So I am not sure which one of those factors caused my epoxy to not cure, but it did not. I had to clean it all out, and I ended up filling the holes with some CA glue, and that turned out to be the fix that I needed. I should have just done that to start with. I put a couple of finishes on a sample board and took it in to show him. This is the finish he decided to go with. This is teak oil. I'm not a big fan of teak oil because it takes such a long time to dry, and I have to sand in between coats. But it turned out amazing. I mean, look at the shine on this thing. Look at the colors. Now, the breadboards are a different color cedar than what the 3-inch edges are, but it gives it just that little bit extra pop. I mean, this board is just absolutely amazing.